Hi. So we are going to continue with the social and intellectual background of the Victorian age and Victorian poetry in specific. And in the last in the last video, I have talked about the progress of science and the consequent crisis of faith in the Victorian era. And in this lecture, in this video, I am going to talk about the Victorian identity. And this is the part 2 of this series of social and intellectual background of the Victorian age. So, identity in the Victorian age mainly stood on three pillars, that is race, gender and class. And these divisions were necessary because the Victorians, they were obsessed with order and control, and they really liked things to be in their own respective places. This division, this demarcation, this classification was kind of the spirit of this age, and the Victorians liked everything in their society to have a certain order and stick to that order. And when everything stuck to that order, it was easier to control everything. So Victorians were really obsessed with order and control. So identity in the Victorian age mainly stood on three things: race, gender and class. And we will study these three things separately, one by one. So beginning with race. Now, to understand the Victorian concept of race, we have to understand, or rather have a recap on one thing which I previously discussed. I discussed this once, I remember, when I was doing Tintin with you. It's called the Great Chain of Being, and it's kind of a divine preordained order. Now, what is the Great Chain of Being? It's kind of a classification. The classification has mainly three realms: the realm of being, the realm of becoming, and below that non-being. So the chain of beings begins with God, and God is himself the being in the Great Chain of Being. Below God there is his angels. Below the angels, the realm of being starts from there, and first we have the demons, and these demons are placed above man, and that is why they are called supernaturals, something that is, let's say, above the natural realm. And then comes man. Man is at the center of everything in this universe. And animals come below man, and plants come below animals. So the world of flora and fauna, they come below man. They are placed below the human race. And below man, animals, plants, there are the minerals, and below the minerals there is this realm of non-being. So this was a kind of order that was believed to have existed in the universe, because universe was supposedly created by God, and therefore this order, this chain of being, was also a kind of God's order. That is what was believed. So the Victorians kind of stuck to that order. And not only did they stick to that order, they also divided it further. And from that division, from that further division, came this division of race in the Victorian period, and race becomes one of the first pillar of Victorian identity. Now, obviously, race means here the human race, the race of man. And the British believed that the human race can also be divided into parts. And when the British in the Victorian age made this chart, they obviously kept themselves, the British race, their own race, at the very top. Below the British race, who were the purest race according to the British themselves, there below that race are the people who are like British, at least who look like British, but not really are British. And these are the other European race, like the French or the Italians. They look like British, they are fair, but they are not really British. So above the British, just below the British race, there are this race that British, but they're not really British. People who are like British but not really were so. Below that are the others, and the others are everyone who are different from the British, and these are mainly the Asians and the Africans. And I remember telling you this concept of the self and the other, and that is the concept used here really. The British is the self, and whoever is not British slowly becomes the other in degrees, other in degrees. This is the process of otherization, as it said. The Victorian the Victorian people in Britain, they had a very high sense of nationalism too. Now, this sense of nationalism was based on race. This is a very racial nationalism that the British had always believed in, and also the other Europeans as well. So this was the division of the human race that the British had made. So as you can understand, they claimed a racial superiority because they placed themselves at the very top. Now, where does this racial superiority comes from? What are the factors behind this racial superiority? The first is the political stability. Like I said in the first video, that it was a very long reign of Queen Victoria. From 1837 to 1901, it is more than 63 years that one single monarch is reigning Britain. And when you have a very long reign of a monarch, you have a long stable government, and this political stability actually was one of the reasons why they thought their race to be so superior. The next one is the expansion, and by this I specifically mean colonialism, the colonial expansion. And you may have heard this phrase that they said very proudly that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And the colonial expansion, the huge British Empire. Now, this was a time like in when Queen Victoria reigned. This expansion was maximum, and Britain governed Canada, Britain governed India, Australia and New Zealand, parts of South America, parts of Africa. Now, this British Empire under Queen Victoria was the largest empire the world has ever seen. So imagine being British and realizing that your queen actually rules like so much of this world, and that is from where this racial superiority comes. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, Queen Victoria was nearly the head of quarter of this world population. Like imagine 25% of this world being controlled by one queen, that is Queen Victoria, and this was the extent of the British Empire. So this expansion, this colonial expansion, was another reason why they claimed their racial superiority. The third reason of this racial superiority was progress, and historians have often very often regarded this Victorian age to be Britain's golden years. And this has many reasons too. This prosperity was due to the rapid increased industrialization that Britain was going through in this Victorian age. It was an era of rapid industrialization, large scale industrialization. Then there was this huge colonial wealth coming in from Britain's colonies, and it resulted in a huge economic progress. And this colonial wealth, we must know that it was not always earned, it was also stolen from these empires. Like if we take our country, India, for example, like there is no end, there is no real calculation about the billions and billions that the British have stolen from India. So this huge colonial wealth coming in, being pumped in into Britain, and the resultant economic progress was another reason why they claimed this superiority. The other thing was trade and commerce. Now, when you have so many empires, trade and commerce was also maximized, and trade and commerce both within Britain and with the empires, the commercial exchange with the empires, that added to their financial glory. Now, this was also an age of technology and scientific progress, engineering. As I have discussed in the previous lecture, this was an era of scientific progress, and Britain was like the hub of scientific progress in this era, in the Victorian era. There was railways that have been invented and popularized, and because of that there was improved communication, improved trade and commerce. There were significant developments in health and medicine, and there was also a very large cultural progress that happened in the Victorian era. So everything kind of contributed to this racial superiority that the British had in this Victorian age. Now that was race. The next one, the next factor of Victorian identity is gender. Now the Victorians believed, as you may have heard this phrase too, that men and women have their own place. And the Victorian concept of gender, it was based on the doctrine of separate spheres. Now men in their own place, women in their own place. Men cannot be claiming women's spaces, and women cannot be claiming men's spaces. And both of these genders had their own places, and they were supposed to stick to that, and that is how the order was going to be maintained, and Victorians loved order. Now Victorian idea of the gender was both biological and binary. Biological because gender was actually sex that was assigned to you at birth, and it was binary because there was only two genders, the male and the female. There is no possibility of any other genders, any third genders in the Victorian age. So gender was a binary. Now gender in the Victorian age, it determined almost every aspect of an individual's character and potential. Character how? Now they like to divide. As I've said, it was based on the doctrine of separate spheres, and men cannot be women and women cannot be men. That's how they believed it to be. Men were strong, rough and independent. Women are weak, kind and dependent. This was the differentiation made in character. Now potential that comes from this character is that men belonged to the public sphere because they are strong, rough and independent. Men were supposed to be warriors, soldiers, colonizers. Men were supposed to go to work and be paid for work, and men were supposed to participate in politics. Women, because they were weak, kind, and dependent, at least their character was thought to be so, women were supposed to stay at home. They were supposed to run the households and give birth and raise children. That was the women's sphere. And these two spheres were markedly different from each other, and they both can never meet. And men and women were supposed to stick to their own spheres and not perform any cross gender activities in such manner. This was strictly forbidden in the Victorian social gendered order. Now, the third pillar of this Victorian identity is the class. And by class, I mean the economic class, the cultural and political class. Now, class was, as you know, class is always divided broadly in three classes. The system is divided into three classes. The upper class were the aristocrats. They were very few, only 5%, only about 5% of population. And these aristocrats, they had titles, wealth, they were landowners, and they owned maximum land in Britain. And these aristocrats, they controlled the local, national, and the imperial politics. So these were the aristocrats. There was also the middle class. Middle class consisted of business owners and some specific higher trade like doctors, the judges of court, these titles. Now, as you know, the Victorian age was also the age where there was a rapid growth of this middle class. This age is considered to be an age where there is the rise of this middle class, and through the 19th century this middle class grew from 15% of the population to 25% of the population. And this middle class were the moral leaders of the society. The Victorian morality, as we take it to be, was actually the Victorian middle class morality that was there. We will discuss Victorian morality in a separate lecture, so I am not going into detail about this here. And then below the upper and the middle class, there was the lower class. This was the working class of laborers and daily wagers. And this working class was about 80% of the British population. And why is this? This is because, as I said, there was a rapid industrialization of England. People moved in from all parts of England into London. So because London was the hub of industrialization, and industrialization and industrial revolution and trade, that will also be discussed in a later lecture, so I'm not going into detail here. Now, these are the three pillars that race, gender and class on which the Victorian identity was based. And the poems in your syllabus also contains traces of all these three. I'll give you some examples that I have found. Now, the first one is about the gender, and as I said, men and women had their own places, the Victorians believed, and these lines come from The Lady of Shalott by Tennyson. 4 grey walls and 4 grey towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott. So Lady of Shalott was supposed to be confined within her tower. And like Lady of Shalott, that is how the women were confined in Victorian era. Women were supposed to be inside the house. They were supposed to be inside the house, and that is their sphere, that is their area of work. And like the Lady of Shalott, they weren't supposed to move out of their house. So this is one example that I found. The Victorian woman was thought to be an angel in the house, and it was said that if this angel of the house, the woman of the house, she steps out of the house into the public sphere, and the public sphere of men, she became impure, and she must be chastised morally. She becomes morally fallen if she goes out. And this also has traces in The Lady of Shalott by Tennyson. No time hath she to sport and play, a charmed web she weaves alway. A curse is on her if she stay her weaving, either night or day. So this is one. The Victorian woman was always supposed to stay inside. This is one I found. This one is from your syllabus. It is about the dominance of Victorian man over woman. As you can understand, that is my Last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. That is my Last Duchess. The woman, the Duchess, she has no other identity apart from being the Duchess to the Duke. And then also the Duke has murdered her. And you also have the same thing, this theme of domination and subjection of women in Porphyria's Lover, that is also by Robert Browning. And in both these poems, you have the dominant man dominating the woman. Not only dominating, they are also killing the women. The Duke, he kills the Duchess and goes on to marry another one. And the same is with Porphyria's Lover. He strangulates her and kills her. So this is another example that I found. This one is about the racial superiority and the aristocratic class consciousness that was there in the Victorian age. They were always very class conscious. In my Last Duchess, you will find this line, gift of a 900 years old name. And the Duke is talking about his title. And because he has an aristocratic title, which is 900 years old, and that is where he puts his superiority feeling. That is from where the superiority feelings come from. So this is an example of racial superiority. Now in Tennyson's Ulysses, there is one way of seeing Ulysses as an imperialist. When we study Ulysses, and of course when we study these other poems, we are going to talk about all these in detail. And we can also read Ulysses from a post-colonial or rather imperial point of view. And when he says that I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart. So this is often interpreted as a British colonial master speaking. I meet and dote unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. This is a kind of a very racist looking at the imperial subjects, the people whom the British have colonized. So these are few things that I could use as an example of what we have studied. So this was part 2 of this lecture. We are going to continue with this series of social and intellectual background from next lecture onwards. Thank you.